Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Lessons of the Woods by 10 Point Whitetails. I'm your host Dylan Porter, and with me we have our co-host Kyle Weber. And today we are going to be discussing whitetail overall herd health. I think I phrased that correctly. But Kyle's got a little bit more idea what he wants to talk about here than me, so I'm going to let him take it away.
See how you just hand it off? Yeah, you just hand it off.
Like a pro.
Um, yeah, at the time of recording, it's mid-April.
Yep.
It'll be out another week or so. Um, and in northern Wisconsin, specifically in the Cable area, we have dealt with a big major melt. This week has substantially taken the snowpack out. We've gotten flooding, highways are closed, high water. It's been kind of a mess. But actually, when you pull into the property on Wits End Ridge now, the driveway, which is what we plowed out with the skid steer, is a river.
Oof.
Because everything on the hill coming towards us is flowing down to the low spot. So it's a mess. But that brings the argument of what is going on with deer and deer herd right now. I had a lovely conversation with the local DNR.
Another one, or
Warden. What?
this is not a new conversation, or is
No,
a little
no,
bit
the original
okay?
one. But
Okay.
the argument was talking about feeding and baiting and why you do it or why you don't do it. And it goes to supplemental feeding and baiting. And I made a comment about, well, I'm just trying to get my deer to survive. I'm trying to keep as many deer to survive this hard, long winter as I possibly can. And he goes, deer have lived here for thousands of years without any help. And that stung. And I think we've talked to Jason, we've talked to Jared, we've talked to Haunted Outdoors, and you listen to any of the professionals like Jeff Sturgis, Don Higgins, the list goes on and on. But they talk about supplemental feeding, what the perks of that is. So one good argument, and this is the discussion I want to have with Dylan, based on your experience with the deer farm, is how the cycle of a deer's health. We're not talking antlers. We're not talking antler growth. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about overall deer herd health. And we'll point out at this point on the arc, antlers are growing.
Mm-hmm.
On this point of the arc, does are, on their trimester. Trimester? They do.
I don't know if they have full trimesters. I don't know.
So, but they're finishing the fawn development. They're giving birth to the fawn.
Late
A
in their
weak
gestation
fawn,
period.
late gestation period. So I made a little graph on a whiteboard. I'm pulling out the Jeff Sturgis trick. Half his videos are in his room with a whiteboard, and he likes to doodle like I do. When I
And
was
we'll do our
working,
best to see it. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spotlight you so you show up better than I do.
um, anytime anybody would ask me a question at work about how to build or how to put things together, I would get the whiteboard out and draw it. I'm just a doodler. So
Makes sense.
so my question is going to be, so we're going to talk about the health or the curve of which a deer, in this case, a 10, which is the healthiest it possibly can be. My argument is there's no such thing as a 10 because they always need food. They're always stressed out, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And then 1 and 2, I would argue, is dying or dead. Where they're laying in a hole. If the wolves or coyotes aren't going to eat on them as they're living, they're going to freeze up and then die anyways. And then we have the months, January through December. So the longer we go this way is later in the year.
Yeah.
So with your experience at the deer farm, Dylan, I want to solely talk about wild deer. But let's talk northern Minnesota, where you're at.
Sure.
Which there's significant differences. Northern Minnesota, you can feed. You can't bait and hunt, but you can feed. No
in
limit.
my county.
In your in his county. So where we're at, it's mid-April.
Mm-hmm.
On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you suggest deer
Mid-April.
herd.
This winter went longer than usual, to an extent. I don't know. Looking back at some of my Facebook memories from 3 years ago, we had snow on the same date last 2-3 years ago, April 3rd or 4th. We got like a foot of snow 2 years in a row. So that's really hard on the deer. Not 2 years in a row, but twice over a 5-year period. So that's really hard on the deer herd. So April, I'd say, they're not in the 1-2 range where they're dying, but I wouldn't put them at above 5 or 6 necessarily. So probably 4, 3.5, 4, somewhere in there.
3.5.
They're recovering.
Okay, 3.5 in mid-April. They got some browse now. The snowpack's going away. The weather's getting warmer, so things are starting to green up.
Yep, and the
Dirt
deer.
has been slow.
The dirt has been, that's just what I was going to talk about. The deer have been going crazy over dirt. So I was driving with a buddy of mine, and he asked, why are the deer hanging out on the railroad tracks so much right now? Now, one might think it's because Governor Walz is baiting them by the railroad tracks so they get hit by the trains, but that's not the case. It's not the case. They're hanging out by the railroad tracks because it's a mound of exposed dirt and rocks, of course, but there is a lot of dirt there, so that it's melted off faster than the rest of it because it's higher, sometimes facing south. So the deer are hanging out by the railroad tracks to get the sunlight and to get access to that soil on the edge of the ditch. And they're doing that on the edge of fields, on the edge of a pond. When I went looking for sheds the other day, there was one pond that had a south-facing bank, 2 ponds, and just the deer have destroyed the grass there. They've destroyed the dirt there. You can see they've been digging in the dirt because a lot of people don't realize that deer need dirt to feed their microbiome in their stomach, good bacteria. So now we're getting through the winter, and they've had the whole winter has been depleting their microbiome because there's no new bacteria because everything they eat is frozen solid. Now the bacteria is coming back to life. They're getting access to better stuff, and the deer they're recovering now. So this is a great time of year for deer. Well, better time of year for deer.
So let's talk June, July. Late June, early July. We got some antler development at this point.
Yep. So if a buck's doing good, they can start showing antlers at this time of year. Right now in April, not likely unless they're doing really, really well health wise. And granted, people keep in mind this is from my area. It can be completely different on the south end of Minnesota. 100% different. South end of Wisconsin, completely different. In my area, this is how I've seen the wild deer react. So now what they're doing is they're dispersing, they're spreading out. May, June, July, I'd say is a full incline. Probably towards July, we'll say late June, early July. The does are at their healthiest. They've dropped their fawns. They're recovering. The food sources are there. The bucks are growing their antlers. The food sources are there. They've started building back up their fat. You could almost put them as high as a 7, 6, maybe 7. June, July.
Okay. Now, what I would argue is August, September.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say September. Just September. They're at their peak. The fawns are healthy.
Yep.
They're the ones that have survived are walking around and they're learning to browse, and they've milked off mom up until this point. She's got plenty of browse, plenty of food, plenty of green. And we're saying plenty of food, even though at my place, before I bought it, there was no food there. There was no use of having a deer besides some woody browse.
Mm-hmm.
But so September, where do you think? 9, 10?
Yeah, they're as high as they're going to get.
Perfect. They got as much food as they need.
10's an ideal circumstance where they have veterinary care. Everything's perfect. Which even on a deer farm, you're probably not going to see a 10 all of the time because things happen. So yeah, that's where you're hitting your upper 8s, early 9, somewhere in there. That August to September range is really when a deer's at their healthiest. They've had food all summer. They're fat and sassy. They feel good. The fawns are growing good. The bucks aren't working on their antlers anymore. The does aren't necessarily nursing as much. So everybody's really doing a lot better at that point.
Well, and I want to point out, September of last year, I sent you that trail camera picture of Ace.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, he's thin. He's struggling. He's having a hard time. Just by a photo.
Yep.
And in so we're talking a 9. So what would you say Ace, knowing how thin he was, so we're going last year, knowing how thin he was, knowing how he didn't have much food, where would you put Ace in September? Right before Hardhorn. Right before.
Probably 6.5.
Okay, I'm gonna do blue. I'll agree with that. I'll agree that the average buck in my area on my land is substantially less because of the food. So I'm gonna give him a 7. How about that?
Sure. Yeah, and in my area here, we got lots of eggs, so the deer they fatten
Yep.
up real quick in the summer.
So now September happens, we go through October, but now the October, these bucks are, they're putting on the poundage for the rut. Um, does, like you said, and this is general deer herd. This is not doe specific because I would say the does through October are probably pretty level.
Mm-hmm.
The bucks are increasing. Their food intake's getting bigger. They're eating more food. Their testosterone's coming out. Their peak, I think, is higher
Yeah.
to argue. But late October, where's the general deer herd? This is where I think the doe and the buck separate. And since we're not really doing a doe or a buck, we're just doing the deer herd. What do you think late October, right before the rut?
Late October, I'd say they're probably still balancing where they're at. It's kind
Okay,
of
so
it doesn't really go up any higher than that. September to October is really their best time
okay.
frame. Now, of course, this
Again,
isn't factoring in hunting or anything like that. This is just the overall health of where
yep.
your deer herd should be in my area.
So now, and we're going to go month by month now because that arc, April to October, it's pretty even. Kind of subtly goes up. But now each month after the rut, November 15th, November 20th, whatever you want to argue.
Yeah. So
The Bucks are
the Bucks
crashing.
are crashing. They're not crashing as low as one might think because they're not shedding their antlers. Now, there's going to be some bucks that do crash and shed their antlers, but there should be starting to be a general decline on your herd on average. Granted, the does are going to hold that up a little bit higher. The bucks are going to bring it down lower. So what we say was 7 in October. So you could probably go down to 6, maybe 5, but probably 6 is probably more. Yeah, I think so. November is not that hard on the deer here. Granted, yes. Do 6. I think that'll work.
December. Now they've gone through the rut, and people are going to argue that it goes down from here. Mm-hmm. But I would argue, my opinion, once they get out of the rut, now the bucks and the does are all catching up. They're trying to put fat back on. They're trying to put some poundage back in. The feed bag is on full bore for both.
Yep, it's really going to depend on. It's going to depend on the weather. If we have a good December, then it's a lot easier on them. If we had a cold December, like this year was a cold December, we got snow and then we got cold. So we'll say maybe they'll go down a little bit, 5.5.
Okay.
But hopefully they plateau at that time in a good year.
Well, that's a little low. So all right. So now January and February. The reserves are shrinking. Yep. They've had all their food, snow covered.
Access to food is harder. January, probably not super low, but I bet you're down to that 4 range.
Okay.
You're falling.
So we're going from a 5.5 to a 4. February?
Well, Minnesota February sucks up here, so that's when you get your negative 40 for 2 weeks straight. And even with good access to food, you still end up with winter kill up here. So that's dropping it right back down to 2. I'd say that's the sharpest drop off. 2.5.
2, which we would agree, 2 isn't dead.
Yep.
But their reserves are shrunk. They're using everything. They're not moving anymore. They're not running around in the woods. They can't because the snow is too deep.
Yep.
Their food source is 100 yards from where their bedding source. They're struggling. Now, March, it's going to depend on the March, but this year, long winter, you could almost go 1.5 because now they've gone through the hardest part of winter, but it just keeps on going forever and ever and ever. Sure. Yeah. So this is, and we talk about the difference, and we're basing it off ACE because we basically got 9 months of cycle with him. We know what buck he was. We watched him on photos. I have photos every week of every month from this time on last year till we harvested him. But if you look at Dylan, so everybody that's on YouTube, by the way, go subscribe and hit the notification, the bell, get on YouTube, because I want to start doing more visual stuff.
Yeah.
Which I know Spotify and Apple Podcasts is a little bit more difficult, but get on the YouTube channel. We can do more of this. Plus, the hunting videos are going to be on there, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at this arc, I'm just going to be kind of sloppy, but
look at that. It's like he's an artiste.
don't. I got some contests coming up, and this is sharp, and this could be maybe a little exaggerated, but the point is after that November rut, after the 1st of November, everybody's exhausted and shot. So, and then they're trying to recover. So there's a little bounce back, but you could almost even argue that, it goes down and kind of does that maybe. And then obviously from December at a 6, they come back from and this is weather dependent, but
yeah, this is weather dependent. It's area dependent. It's buck or doe dependent. This is general that we just did here, but yeah, if you do a buck versus a doe, it's going to be drastically different in some areas. The does don't drop off immediately after the rut near as much as the bucks do, because they are maintaining their health because they're growing a fawn, where the bucks, they did a lot of work and they drop sharply, and then they drop even worse in that January and February range than the does do.
Well, and think about this too. During the rut, a buck chases for 2 weeks between fighting other bucks, chasing down the doe in heat. In 2 weeks he's just full bore running, not eating, one thing on his mind. That doe that's hot, she gets chased for what, 3 days?
Yeah.
Guessing, So she ran for 3 days. Now she gets to start recovering. Meanwhile, eating the whole time.
Yep.
She still eats even though he's hounding her.
We've had bucks on the farm that they didn't breed a doe. We didn't let them breed a doe. They were in a pen, secluded, away from the does. They'll lose 40 to 50 pounds because they just quit eating. They get so stressed out that they're like, we don't want to eat. The bucks that do breed the does, they quit eating and they run a long ways. So we learned early on, put your bucks that you want to breed a bunch of does into a smaller pen so they don't have to chase them a couple 100 yards. And then the does cooperate. Higher conception rates, then it's less difficult on the buck. But if a buck in the wild has to chase a doe a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles throughout the course of him hounding her, he's wore out. I'm not in shape. I can't do that much running, and these bucks are doing it for 2 weeks straight.
So, to your point, a doe gets to recover relatively easier and faster. Their rut exercise is very short-lived compared to a buck. But I'm just gonna, for Ace, for argument's sake, we talked about how bad he looked last year due to lack of food, and I'm just giving him kind of a lesser chance. Let's put it that way. So I agree. Now you go like this. Let's say the bottom's pretty similar.
Mm-hmm.
As far as obviously the deer didn't die, so he didn't hit a 1 or a 0. He did not die, but now imagine his arc. And this is a clear representation of antler growth too. Mm-hmm. We're talking about from April to September antler growth. Meanwhile, trying to catch back up with his health, his body health, his food intake, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, with the representation that my Ace or the bucks at my property are significantly less than other places, you can guess that space is equal, maybe except for the bottom. I think they all hit the bottom. They kind of all crash, and either they die or they make it. And I think that's a good representation of that. But I want to argue. Go ahead.
The biggest difference between the two lines there is food.
Yes, at their peak.
Yep.
And that's why we talk about food plots and tonnage and having clover and year-long food. Yes, we could wait and plant an annual. We could plant an annual in August and have food for this. And this might help, especially after the rut. They'll need to put the feed bag on. But we're talking this arc, and if I put up perennials and have summertime food, and I know deer, doe factories, I know that whole thing, but I want food here to maybe this year get from here. Instead of tracking up, I can come up and get into Dylan's red line and catch up and track off of this. Get away from my initial blue line that was last year. Last year we didn't have food till July, I don't think. We opened it in June.
Yeah. So for those of you again listening on the podcast apps here, go on to YouTube or Facebook, preferably YouTube. They let us get away with more, and see the graph that we're working with here. It's actually a really good visual representation of what we're talking about.
So now I want to talk about, how do I say it? This year, for example, this is kind of standard, but now this year, we could argue that this arc, which usually should be in March, going back up.
Mm-hmm.
This year, we can say all of April. We got all the way into April, halfway through April, without decent weather.
Yep.
Now we're tracking way down. Now, if we track way down, is that a even representation of this? Would you say, Dylan, that a delay in the winter here affects here?
Yeah, so a delay this winter could definitely slow down the arc of recovery, right? So for audio purposes, a delay in April can slow down and not cause them to reach their optimum peak as high as they should in the August and September months. So yeah, it can absolutely slow it down, and it can change it should slow it down on average, but some deer might still be able to hit that peak amount of peak health. But we already established, looking at trail cam pictures from Wits End Ridge versus here, the deer are skinnier there. They're not doing as well. Where in a full ag area, the deer are recovered. And when I say skinny, it's not like, oh, well, your deer isn't fat. No, I see the hips on your buck in September, and we can count as ribs. That's not optimum.
Yep.
Where, yes, there are, if you overfeed your dog, they can get obese. It's not that type of scenario. Yeah, our deer are fat and sassy, but I'm not saying they're obese from getting too much access to feed. We're saying they're a really nice, healthy weight.
Well, and we talked about your deer in a captive space, how much they can eat a day, and they have as much as they possibly need until they are fat and obese. They could eat all they wanted. It was 2 to 4 pounds a day.
Yep.
So coming back to the DNR conversation, deer have survived here for thousands of years. I am 100% with you on that. That statement is true. They have survived this arc and this pendulum every year. But a bad winter gets them down to this one, and 300 deer die in the general area because of winter kill.
Yep.
Okay, fine. Good year. Now they do great, and that curve fluctuates. And I agree, they survive. But when you want to hit a 9 or a 10, and you want these deer to get to their genetic potential, and you don't want a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old to get down to this one and die because you want them to survive, and you talk about supplemental feeding them, giving them any assistance they have. The problem with food plots up here is once you get 3 feet of snow, I don't care what you plant, it is useless.
Yep,
they will dig as long as they can, but even when they walk out on the food plot and walk off, they've compacted that snow, harder to dig. They won't touch it. I don't care what you have in there. I don't care what you plant. That's winter food plot. Once the snowpack gets up here, they won't dig for it. It's just, that's what sucks in our area specifically. You go an hour south, 2 hours south, it's totally different. But now let's talk about if the DNR gave Wisconsin, specifically me, the ability to feed, supplemental feeding. And we're talking minerals and good stuff, not just corn. We're talking what they really need. Sorry, I got a pet peeve with corn. So let's say he's got all the food plots he wants, all the perennials and annuals to eat. Now, the next target buck, let's say, is matching Dylan's, and let's say he's a 9.5. He's got all the food he wants to eat, but he's still got to go through life or a year's schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So he, again, gets to the rut, plateaus a little bit, he hard horns up, and then he hits that rut. And we're talking late November, he crashes. And now all my food plot work has done, and it's kept him a hair above Dylan. But if we don't have any supplemental feeding, if we don't give them any mineral, any extra food, and they go through that same cycle, they're going to do nothing but end up back down here.
Mm-hmm.
They're great up here, but if they wash through the reserves, they're here.
Yeah, by February, March, they're still hitting that bottom of the barrel.
And people listening, when I say here, I'm talking about the 1 or 2 in February, March. So now let's say December comes, and they've crashed a little. He's having a hard time. He's down to like a 5. Fine. But the season's over. January 6th or 7th, the season ends. I implement supplemental feeding. I'm going to feed them out of my financial pocket, my own pocket. I'm going to feed these deer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not asking them to help or do anything. I'm just going to feed them on my place. All right. This is where the biggest improvement is what you'll see. And this is the next year. Now, remember, this is this fall. They've gotten food plots. They've gotten the perennials all summer long. The does and the fawns are healthy. They're coming down. They go through the rut. We're here, which is better than Dylan's at this point. January hits. January hits, and we're at a 5.5 for people listening. But I maintain, let's say, half of what Dylan said. And I believe, Dylan, you said 2 to 4 pounds. Was it not?
Yep, 2 to 4 pounds for a doe. Bucks maybe a little bit more depending on the time of year. But yeah, 2 to 4 pounds on average of food consumption.
So that's per day. They're not getting that out of the browse in the woods, especially when there's a snowpack. So just think about how much food. Go get a gallon of corn and weigh it and realize how much one single deer needs to eat it. I have a 15 deer herd that's stuck around, residential deer herd. 15 a day. 15 times 4 is 60. So 60 pounds a day. Let's say I maintain that legally. Let's say they green light it, and legally I put 60 pounds out a day. Where would you say that arch, starting on 5.5, is in February if I maintain that food?
4.
All right.
3.5, 4.
And I'm not talking corn. I'm talking
premium, all he can eat. Yep.
So we're talking 4 in February. Now, even if we follow that, let's go March.
Probably still a 4.
Okay.
Yeah, it's cold, but as long as they got enough to eat. So what a lot of people don't realize too, deer are ruminants. So when they are chewing their cud and they have that action going in their stomach, a deer will starve to death before they freeze to death. Or no, freeze to death before they starve to death, excuse me. Because if they lose that chewing action, they don't have good food in their stomach, they'll just freeze to death. So that's very important to keep their bellies full, and that can help them through a longer winter so much better than not having it.
And now, April comes, green up happens, the perennials, food plots kick back in. Great. I'm just going to follow the arc that we have established on your deer and my deer. I'm just going to follow that arc. I'm not going to deviate from it. But my argument is, what happens then? Is there an argument that if I follow that, that was last, that would be this fall. Wouldn't there be an argument that this would even be higher then?
Potentially, yeah, because he's healthier starting out. So even going at that angle, you're going to end up higher.
So my point is, if you can establish your deer herd to start in February, March higher, there's a significant chance, following the arc of the summer anyways, that you're going to be improving the next year. And the argument is the same. Then it goes, and we could add 10 points to this because we talk about 10 being perfect, but let's say perfect for our area. Now it's higher, so now it follows the same arc down, but it's higher.
They don't fall as low when they start higher again.
They don't fall as low, and then maybe you keep continuing with this. Now, the argument is, what happens if we have a hard winter? Okay, so let's say they go through this doesn't happen, and we have an absolutely miserable winter, and they start at a 6 and they crash. Let's say January and February are the worst months we've ever had, and
Yep.
they crash. They're crashing from a 6, not a 3.
Yeah.
Where now, yeah, maybe they crash at that 2, that 1, 2, let's say 2 range. Now they're coming back. Now, my point with this is at my deer, let's say locally, 20 deer died from winter kill. We had a taxidermist post on his website. They found 5 deer dead just in his property. Those aren't wolf and coyote kills. Wolves and coyotes have gotten to them.
Yeah.
Those are winter kill. So let's say 20 here. I'd say in a perfect world, 3 up here. But now we have that hard winter, and these deer come crashing down low, but they're crashing from a 6. What do you figure if that's 20? How many deer die from here? 5?
Yeah, 5, 8.
Arguing,
Yep.
So let's say 8. But now your winter kills 8, where if it would have been down here, it had 20. That's a good example of the arc and what would help the winter kill. And it's basically starting at a 5.5, going through the cycle, brings you to a 6, you go through the cycle. And then maybe you can afford a really bad winter. Now, we go through a really hard winter, we drop from a 6 all the way down to a 2, we lose 8 deer in the herd, which is better than the 20, but my point being, I would recommend or I would think and suggest that these healthy deer that went through a hard winter now can bounce back easier than following the normal arc. You would think that they come down here and they just follow this arc around. I actually think if they have the ability, all the food, all the perennials, all of that, they're going to improve better than summer months. I might be talking out of my butt. That's.
No, I think it makes perfect sense. Because really, what you want to do is flatten the curve and help them do better. You want. I'm just using terminology that we're all familiar with. Flatten the curve. Don't make that face at me. But you want to have it so there's less of a curve, right? You want to try to get it to where it's level all the way across. So if you took this same ideology and went down to I don't know the area, I'm just guessing, like Tennessee, right? And now the deer are they don't drop past, they maybe never drop past a 4. And then they just bounce up and they go back to a 7 and then back to a 4 throughout the course of these months. And they're doing a lot better than our deer on average. Now, in my experience on the farm, we probably never drop below a 4 or a 5 with my dad's herd. I mean, winter's got to be really hard to drop past that point because not only do we provide food all winter, we provide water all winter. So they don't have to work for anything.
And no predator.
No predators, no hunting pressure. They get what they want when they need it. The feeder never runs empty. Third cutting dairy hay all winter. So if we can keep that, from a 5 to a 10, 6 to a 10 all year long, it gives our deer the perfect chance to hit their maximum antler goals, to have the healthiest fawns we can have. Twins are always almost 100% twins, if not triplets occasionally. Very rarely do we have a single at my dad's farm, and if we have a single, it's usually a younger doe. But that's because they're in optimum circumstances all year long, and we've essentially flattened that curve to where it's just a little hill instead of a steep, sharp curve.
Well, and you think about that too, is if the deer is not having to rebound from a low 1-2, let's talk specifically a buck. If he doesn't have to rebound from a 1 or 2, but he's more 3-4 or 3-2, he doesn't have to put a bunch into his body. He can bounce right into antler growth. Let's say he's 4 years old. Now he's pumping nutrition and benefit and all that into his antlers up here.
Yep.
And then his antler growth gets all the attention because his body's like, we're good. We're fine. Athletes, when they get hurt, they have to sit down. They can't exercise because all of their nutrition, all their body, everything's going to that fixing that injury. So they can't, worry about anything else.
The body has to repair before it can grow.
Yeah. So would you rather have your deer trying to start growing antlers on a 1-2 basis or a 3-4 basis? And supplemental feeding, making sure they don't hit that 1-2, that they hit that 4-3-4 is
Mm-hmm.
obviously more beneficial to antler growth specifically. And that goes for the fawns and the does. The healthier the doe, the healthier the fawn, the easier we're coming off a 3-4, not a 1-2.
Yep.
Now we have a buddy, Jared Dalton from Iowa. He's an Iowegian, and we talk about how bad their winters are. And I was like, our deer would love being down there. Not that our deer are stronger, not that our deer are better, but our deer deal with a lot more than his deer do. And I'm this is an analogy, and I'm working my way through it, but their winters aren't as bad. So I'm gonna say at their worst, they're a 4. They get a little snow covering, 7-8 inches. It melts. They still can dig their food plots. They still can eat the browse, and they have a lot more egg out there, standing corn, etc.
Yep.
So if
And it's
we,
only below 30 for a couple of weeks.
and it only gets cold. You bring one of his deer up here, that deer is dead in a week up here. But let's just say he doesn't get past a 9 or a 10. Obviously can't go past 10. But let's say he gets to a 9 or 10 also, right?
Yep.
At the same time that we do. Their rut's actually later, correct?
That I'm not 100% sure on.
I believe
It
their
would,
rut's
it would make sense.
time-wise.
Their fawns can be born sooner or later in the year without much adverse effects.
So if you go like this, and again, if you're listening on a podcast, I'm sorry, but I put the high for Jared's deer or Iowa deer at that 9 at the same time as Dylan's deer.
In
But
that
what my
August,
argument is
September area.
August, September, and what I'm arguing is their bottom doesn't go down as much. And we get this flattening of the curve. And I really hope everybody's watching it on YouTube to visually understand what the hell I'm talking about. Pardon my French.
We're going to lose our clean apple rating now.
Yeah,
Hold on.
well, my argument is this promotes bigger antler growth.
Yep.
And that is why places like Iowa, Buffalo County, Wisconsin, southern Minnesota, Illinois, Kentucky, along with the benefits of supplemental feeding in a lot of those areas being legal, Ohio can feed.
Kansas, I think they can feed, and if they can't,
Yep.
they still have
Garrett,
the more mild climate.
Yep. So that's why people are drawn to go to Kentucky and drawn to go to Iowa and these Midwest, southern Midwest states for whitetail hunting, because it's better there, because they have less of an arc and you can get more deer up there growing bigger antlers and being healthier in general.
Mm-hmm.
Because this same arc, I would say, is very close. I'll go blue. Let's talk Buffalo County. That's 2.5 hours away from me. On the map, it's the same area.
Pretty
But
much.
why is it significantly different? Well, they have way more egg. The hunting is QDM. They do a lot of deer management down there, but they have a lot of egg, and their winters are way different. So let's split the difference, and let's still give them a 9 or a 10, or excuse me, 9. Why is Buffalo County and Iowa deer better equipped on the antler scale if they're still at a 9 or a 10? Anyways, why is their antler so much bigger? Well, because they started early, they started faster. They started at a 3 or a 4 rather than a 1 or a 2 where our deer get.
Yep. So they have the like we've said in the past, feed doesn't make them bigger, but it'll help them reach their genetic potential. So when they aren't stressed, when they aren't stressed as much, aren't suffering as much as a deer farther north, they're able to hit their genetic. I forgot what I was going to say. They're able to hit their genetic max on what they can do easier than a deer that's suffering. So what can we do on our land? We can't change the weather. We have no control over that. That's the government's deal. I'm just kidding. No, it's not. Maybe. we can't control the weather, but what we can do, and what is being taken away from us in a lot of Minnesota and most of Wisconsin, is feed the deer to help flatten the curve.
Yes. And, Buffalo County, I think, has the most in the record book anywhere per county. And Wisconsin's one of the best in the country as far as trophy deer. I think that's going to change. I think Ohio and all of them are going to pass us soon. But I think we have fertile ground. Especially down in Buffalo County, Tripolo County, we have fertile ground. If Wisconsin DNR could get their heads out of their butt, we could be top. World record could be shot out of there anytime soon, and we could definitely be adding to the books. So, but I'm very for supplemental feeding, especially if you're willing to do it on your own financial status. If you're willing to do it yourself, not asking for any help, but you're willing to do it yourself, and you own the private land and you're willing to do it. I talk about that. I think that's important. I think you should be able to do that. I think the DNR saying we can't or it's illegal is
it's disheartening, because you can help your deer, but you're not being allowed to.
So what we say, flatten the curve.
Should that be the episode title?
Yep. Flatten the curve. So my argument is, what can be done by a deer hunter besides breaking the law? What can a deer hunter do to change? I'm not talking about hunting over a corn pile. I don't care if you hunt over a corn pile or not. That's not my point. If you're willing to supplemental feed your deer herd, what can a deer hunter do, since that is illegal? What can you do? Well, join a club or an organization that's willing to promote the best interest for the deer hunter. The DNR do not, in my opinion, care about the deer hunter. They care about revenue, ticket sales. They don't even care about the wildlife, because the warden that I spoke to said they survived for thousands of years. Yes, but they survived, for you people not watching on YouTube, at a 1 and 2 basis every other year when the winter was bad.
Yep.
Yes, they survived, but is this surviving? Barely. If you want to have a trophy animal or a healthy deer herd, not even antlers.
Yep. Take antlers out of the equation. We want healthy animals.
I want to prosper at a 6 and a 5, not a 1 and a 2. And his statement, they've survived for thousands of years. Yes, the species of the white-tailed deer is resilient. But the 9 or 5 deer that taxidermist found in his yard shows you they're still susceptible of dying. If he'd have been feeding, it will not save all animals, but it will save some.
Yeah.
And over years and years and years of feeding, you can create this curve, improve the curve, and also
flatten the curve.
Thank you. So if you're not a part of it now, find an organization that wants to support the deer hunter and his best interests, which his best interests are a healthy deer herd that increases property values, that increases the experience hunting, that improves the memories made. Again, property values.
Yeah.
So join a club, start a club, figure out something when it comes to looking for your interests, not what the DNR show. I know Minnesota has a deer hunting organization. I'm sure Wisconsin does, but I don't. They're not relevant. They're not big enough to even be noticed, even by me on my. We have the ABC Sportsman Club, which is Ashland Bayfield County Sportsman Club. They're just not that they're just something, but that'd be a good place to start.
Yeah.
I know they did a feeding program, so they bought feed and sold it for basically half price to you, and you just had to be a member.
That helps flatten the curve.
They're trying to get this out of it.
Yeah.
They're just small. So if you're willing to do this, go to them, talk to them, join their club. Go
just
down.
Make sure they represent you, because the clubs in Minnesota are currently, not all the clubs, specifically the MDHA is not speaking for the hunter at this time in Minnesota, and that's every MDHA member. Almost every MDHA member in the northern half of the state will attest to that. that they don't speak for the hunters, because MDHA is happy to have a seat at the table to discuss laws, but they don't use their seat at the table. So there was a meeting this past week to discuss an indefinite ban on wolf hunting in Minnesota. So that means for all future generations, we will never shoot a wolf with a license legally in Minnesota. MDHA is at the meeting. They don't speak up. So that doesn't necessarily make sense to me. So when you're picking your club, there's a plethora of clubs to choose from. I know in Minnesota we have MDHA, we have rod and gun clubs, we have different sportsmen's clubs, we have minnow clubs, we have Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited. I mean, XYZ. Minnesota is a very active sportsman's club state. We love hunting and fishing in this state. But unfortunately, the biggest clubs in the state, the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association and Bluffland Whitetails, have become just a arm of the DNR to use for legislative purposes to say they speak for all the hunters. So if you want a wolf season in Minnesota to help flatten the curve, if you want to be able to feed your deer in Minnesota to help flatten the curve, find a club that speaks for you. And we might be starting one ourselves. We're talking about it. It's in the works. Whether it's us or another club, but find a club that speaks for you and have a voice. Or we are going to lose our heritage of hunting and fishing in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Not to be a Debbie Downer or anything, but that's kind of what we're talking about, right? To an extent?
No, it's to... If you're upset that you can't feed your deer, supplemental feed. If you argue that you can't hunt on your property, if you argue that you can't use animal byproducts such as urine, mineral blocks, animal byproducts such as urine, glands, whatever.
Those are pretty much the only two.
If you can't use those, you can't feed, you can't use the animal byproducts, you can't sit over a mineral bay, you can't sit over agriculture, you can't. Wait till they say we can't use trail cameras, Dylan, because that's coming.
Mm-hmm.
Was it Kentucky?
I think so.
Kentucky just passed a law that on public land you can't use it. And I'll argue private land should have more privileges. Yes, you have a right to hunt. But I understand you can't hang tree stands out and they can't stay this long, But on private land, I can hang a tree stand and it can stay there.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. It's my land. It's my tree. If I want to have trail cameras out on my property, I'm going to. Mm-hmm. The moment you say I can't do trail cameras on my property, now I have surveillance cameras on my property.
Yep.
I can't.
Minnesota's already looked into laws to not allow the use of cell cams.
Yep.
Because they don't want, because you're cheating. You're going to change how you hunt based on what you see on your cell cam. So they want it because you're not allowed to use your phone when you're hunting. That's a law on the books. You're not allowed to get a text message from your buddy saying, "Hey, I saw a buck. He's heading your way." That's illegal. By the way, that's illegal. So now they want to say, well, if you're using a cell cam and you get a text on your phone that says the deer's here, that's illegal. Can't do that anymore. But I'm going to argue if we're making those two things illegal, is looking at your weather app illegal because it changes how you hunt. Are they going to outlaw on-X hunting? Where is this going, people? We gotta do something, or it's going to get out of hand. So if you like using trail cameras, if you like using cell cameras, come on, guys, Tacticam, contact us.
That's a conversation I'd like to do on the next podcast. Is what's ethics? What's technology, and where's the line? Where do we draw that? But if you're sick of I can't, join a club, talk to a group of people, like-minded people, get on board with them specifically. Whether we do it or you find somebody that is like-minded and wants to represent the deer hunter, because MDHA, Wisconsin DNR, I believe, is more for benefits outside of the best interest of. And we have the CDAC, County Direction, whatever. So Bayville County has a group that represents our like-mindedness to talk about quotas and stuff like that. But they've already admitted that they'll never manage the deer herd for trophy whitetails. They will never manage it for deer antler. They're just managing it for tags, for quotas, to maintain the deer population. If it prospers, let it prosper. If it's going to crash because of a hard winter, not let it crash, but your maintenance of it shouldn't be dictated by insurance, lobbyists, politicians, etc., etc. Is that person going out there having a good experience hunting? We're getting off on a tangent. I get that. But if you're interested in supporting and helping your deer herd, find a club that's like-minded with that, potentially supplemental feeding, and flatten the curve.
And I think that's where we're going to end it. Flatten the curve, guys. This is brought to you by COVID-19. I'm just kidding. But it's a useful term, unfortunately.
No, it's
as much tongue-in-cheek as we want to use it here. Yep. Flatten the curve. Take care of your deer. We'll be back next week with another episode, if everything goes well. And you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, Spotify. Look up Lessons of the Woods on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And then 10 Point Whitetails on YouTube and Facebook. And yeah, we'll be dropping a hunting video probably not too long after this one comes out, if things go well. So, we say if things go well a lot, but anyway, thank you for watching us. We'll see you guys next time.